Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am speaking with Bence Nanay. Bence is a professor of philosophy at the University of Antwerp, and he is much interested in philosophy of mind, philosophy of biology and aesthetics, and he's widely published in the scientific journals. He's written a handful of books, including the most recent, Mental Imagery, Philosophy, Psychology, Neuroscience, and that's what we talk about in this conversation. I wanted to get him on because I wanted to talk about these ideas of perception, and mental imagery is not the same, but is connected with perception, so I was very excited about that. We start by talking about what is mental imagery and how it's defined and what it is and what it is not. We talk about representations a lot in the conversation. We talk about how mental imagery is psychological and what that means. We talk about mental imagery as being an unconscious process. We talk about predictive processing, the role of the body, multimodal, multisensory dimensions. We talk about disorders of mental imagery. We have a fun bit in there about EMDR, I really enjoyed that part of the conversation as well. Talk about some of the metaphysical questions of mental imagery. Talk about a phenomenology of perception, mental imagery in art and the aesthetics, and many other topics. Again, this was a really fun conversation, and it feels like a conversation, less of an interview of sorts. And he was absolutely wonderful, super brilliant, super sharp, and just super engaging. And I really enjoyed the conversation that we had. As always, you can find this conversation, all of the conversations at Converging Dialogues at substack.com. Subscribe there, share widely, and also on YouTube as well. Same thing, Converging Dialogues. And now I bring you Bence Nanay. I'm here with Bence Nanay. Bence, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you. So you've written a really wonderful book. I know it's not your first book, and you've written a handful of things. The book is called Mental Imagery, Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience. So we'll talk all about that. Before we get to the book, why don't you just tell folks just a snapshot of who you are, what your professional academic background is, and what you're currently up to.
So I was born in Hungary. I studied in England and the US, where I did my PhD, and then I started working in the US, and then I worked in Canada, and then in the UK, and now I'm in Belgium. And I'm my main research is on philosophy of mind, philosophy of perception, and cognitive science. And I just brought this book, which is what we're going to talk about, on mental imagery, which I've been working on for a very long time. And it's finally done. So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, it's just wonderful. It's pretty wide spanning. I mean, the subtitle there is pretty accurate. There's a lot of philosophy in there. There's neuroscience. There's a little phenomenology and perception, and there's so many different things in there, and it's well organized. I found it really easy to read in some ways in terms of like the flow of it and how it is. So you can talk a little bit if you want about how the process of the book, but I guess most importantly, maybe talk about what is mental imagery and how we define it, and how does it look in various aspects of life. It seems like it's a pretty key variable for many things for you.
Sure, but maybe first I want to say something about just you mentioned that it's about philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. So I really, the way I do philosophy is by trying to use any kind of information we have about the mind to try to understand the mind. So I don't think that philosophy has a privileged place in understanding the mind. Psychologists have been doing that for a long time. Neuroscientists, not such a long time, but very efficiently in the last couple of decades. So what I want to do is to really try kind of unite the information we have from philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience in general. That's what I'm trying to do when I'm trying to write about various mental phenomena, and this is exactly what I was trying to do in this book. And so kind of bringing in neuroscience and psychology and philosophy is, on the one hand, it's tricky, right? Because then you have to explain all these concepts, because very few readers will have backgrounds in all these three things. On the other hand, given that I will have to explain, I have explained all the basic concepts in philosophy, in psychology, in neuroscience, you can read this book even if you have no background in any of those, or if you don't have any background in one or the other or any of them. So it should be. I wrote this book in a way that it does not somehow presuppose some kind of familiarity with any of the traditions. So you asked me what's mental imagery?
Yeah.
So if you close your eyes and visualize an apple, can you do that?
Yeah, got it.
There you go. Then that's mental imagery. That's going to be one form in which you have mental imagery. Not everyone will experience something. So there's this relatively recent phenomenon called aphantasia. If you close your eyes and try to visualize an apple, nothing comes up. And there's apparently 5 to 8% of population, they have aphantasia. So for them, that's probably not going to be a very helpful intro to mental imagery. But I use the term in a much broader sense. So I want to say that when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, that will count as mental imagery, but lots of other things will count as mental imagery as well. So the way I define mental imagery is that it's a kind of perceptual representation. It's a perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by the sensory input.
So I guess the question I have on this is kind of in the inverse. So what isn't mental imagery? If mental imagery is in many things, and if I can close my eyes and I can think about whatever my priors are about, when I close my eyes and think of an apple, I think of, just kind of a red apple, and that's just kind of, it's just sitting in space, whatever. But it might be different for other people. They might think of a tree and apples on it or whatever. But what is not, I guess, included in mental imagery?
Good. So the way this book is structured is that I'm going through all these mental phenomena, and I try to kind of show that mental imagery plays a role in most of them. So there's I start with mental imagery itself, and then I talk about perception, the role mental imagery plays in perception, which I argue is very significant. And so I go through all these phenomena, and I argue that mental imagery just plays a huge role in all of these things. And then I wrote a kind of an afterword, like an epilogue, where I say that this must be a really frustrating read for the reader, that just go through everything, like everything that happens in the mind, and I make the point that hey, it's all just mental imagery. And so I asked, so what is non-mental imagery? But I think that there's a lot in the human mind that's not mental imagery. So what I call mental imagery, and this is not my idea, I'm following the kind of psychological neuroscientific consensus on this. So mental imagery is a very specific kind of perceptual representation. So in the human mind, there's a lot of different kinds of representations. There's clearly non-perceptual representation. There's a lot of non-representations, right? Like there's non-representational retinal processing that's in the mind, and it's part of our mental apparatus, but that's not a perceptual representation at all. So that's not going to count. There's not a representation at all. There's going to be non-perceptual representations like beliefs or convictions. That's also not going to count not even remotely mental imagery, because it's not any kind of perceptual representation. But not even all perceptual representation is going to count. Only those perceptual representations are going to count as mental imagery that are not directly triggered by the sensory input. So first of all, we have to kind of zero in on the representations that we have in our mind. From that category, the perceptual representations, that are representation in our perceptual system. And from that category, those perceptual representations that are not somehow directly triggered by the sensory input. Those are going to be mental imagery.
So I'm wondering here, if I can't find something in my mind's eye, if you will, if I can't create an image of something, does that mean I don't want to necessarily make a kind of an empirical statement, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? I mean, it can still exist even if I can't have a mental image of it, or maybe not. But what do we do in that scenario where if we're in a novel situation, or if we're having a novel interaction, let's say for the first time for the person, and we can't access anything, is it then we're just doing association kinds of things of like, well, this is something similar, I think, to what this is, and so, but are we trying to develop a new picture, in those novel experiences? Or I guess how does it kind of, how does it generate if we haven't had any of those kind of novel experiences?
Can you give me an example of what you have in mind?
Yeah. So like, I've never been to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what it looks like uh, experientially. So I know what I've seen. I can look in pictures online or in a book or in films or whatever, but I don't know. So if you were telling me to talk about a specific flower or a specific tree or a specific whatever that's unique to Vietnam, I can't get an image of that in my mind because I haven't had the experience of it. That's one example. I think the other things that you discussed are also some of those examples. Like, if you ask someone what's love, yeah, you can't, people aren't going to get an image of that. So I guess in both of those ways, how do we come to understanding with those two kind of categorical differences?
Good. So first of all, yeah, there's lots of things that you're not really in a position to have an accurate mental imagery of because you've never seen it or you don't have a very good description of. That's your question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in terms of Vietnam, I've never been to Vietnam either. I've been to some neighboring countries, but I have if you ask me to have conjure up mental imagery of Vietnam, I could do something, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the basis of the things that I've seen in Cambodia and in Thailand, but also the films that I saw about Vietnam and the pictures I saw about Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So those can be input. I mean, is that reliable? Probably not. Mm-hmm. But neither is my memory of Cambodia reliable. Mm-hmm. So I'm not. I wouldn't be too worried about that. But yeah, so and also, I mean, one interesting thing about the human mind is to be very good at generating new representations. Very much, and that very much includes new instances of mental imagery. So so the unicorns don't exist, right? I have no chance of ever seeing a unicorn, but I can form, even if I've never seen a unicorn picture before. If you tell me that unicorn is a horse that has one horn on its forehead, then I can visualize that. Mm-hmm. So that's mental image is a really nice kind of representation that that at least in some cases of this productivity of the human mind it works very well for mental imagery, which is kind of weird because the productivity of the human mind often has been taken to be a sign that the human mind is full of propositional attitudes, like beliefs that are kind of linguistically or syntactically structured. And mental imagery is not syntactically structured. Nonetheless, it's very good at this kind of combination or combinational thing.
I'll come to memory and perception in a minute, but you've mentioned a bunch of times that, well, one thing, you make this statement that mental imagery is a psychological phenomenon. You say how it's perceptual representation not triggered by sensory input.
Yeah.
So I guess how is it a psychological phenomenon? And I guess how is mental imagery different than even I just use it, right? The mind's eye, images, visualizing. How is it different, I guess?
So it's a psychological phenomenon in the sense that it's happening in our head. But maybe what you have in mind is that I'm using the psychological definition. So philosopher, so I want to move away from kind of trusting our introspective evidence on mental imagery. So 50 years ago, when people were writing about things like mental imagery, they were closing their eyes, visualizing an apple, and then writing about the experiences they had. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a very good idea to do that. And I don't think it's a very good idea to do philosophy on the basis of introspection. Partly because we have much better data points from the empirical sciences, and partly because we know that introspection is incredibly unreliable. We're very wrong about the vast majority of the things that we introspect. And this is especially dangerous. This game is especially dangerous when it comes to mental imagery because of the stuff that we talked about already, this big, huge interpersonal variations between different people, how strong or how vivid their imagery is. So again, some part of the population, they just report no conscious imagery whatsoever. They say, I just don't, I close my eyes and visualize an apple and there's no image comes up. So that is a very different kind of introspective report from so these people are called aphantasia subjects, and the opposite end of the spectrum is hyperaphantasia, where they have incredibly vivid mental imagery. So much so that sometimes they imagine doing something, and then they like 5 minutes later they actually think that they did that thing. So you know, I think that, oh shit, I should take out the garbage. And I imagine myself taking out the garbage, and you know, half an hour later, my wife asked me, "So did you take out the garbage?" Yes, I did. I didn't. I just imagined it. So that's hyperaphantasia, which is a very vivid imagery, and aphantasia when there's no vividness whatsoever. There's no imagery, no conscious imagery whatsoever. So most of us are somewhere in between, right?
Yeah.
But that kind of shows you that it's a very bad idea to follow your introspective evidence when it comes to mental imagery, because if someone has aphantasia, they're going to have a very different theory than someone who has hyperaphantasia.
So I guess the question I have here is how do we, it is dependent on different folks, you know, have different, you know, histories and backgrounds, but you make the claim that it's much of mental imagery is unconscious and involuntary, and all the senses can kind of be involved. So, you know, taste, touch, you know, smell. So it's not just actual visual images. So you can tell me if you want to go down this road or not, but many people will talk about, you know, the Bayesian brain, they'll talk about Bayesian priors, and we don't know where those originate from necessarily. If that's connected here, you can explain that. But I guess if it is unconscious, if mental imagery is unconscious and it is sort of involuntary, how do we know how these things are working as a kind of, I guess you can say kind of a foundational way of doing it? If it's different for you, right? If you see the apple in your mind's eye, in the mental imagery piece of it, differently than I do, how can we know what is conceptually kind of a baseline? Or I don't want to, I guess I'm kind of looking for a universal, but not really. How can we know about the idea and then also have variance with how different people will see it if it's involuntary and unconscious?
Good. So I think that's a very important question, and that's exactly why I think we should use the term mental imagery in a way that's publicly observable. So it's not based on first person report that I say that, oh, I have mental imagery, oh, I don't have mental imagery, because you might be wrong, because you might have unconscious mental imagery. So why do I go on about unconscious mental imagery, or why do I think that that's a big thing? Well, because we know that perception can be conscious or unconscious. Right? There's a lot of really pretty solid evidence that unconscious priming works. So if during this little YouTube video, you flash an image of a cat very briefly, so that your viewers are not going to be able to, they have no idea that this happened, it's still going to influence your behavior. You're going to be quicker at recognizing cats afterwards, for example. So unconscious perception is a thing. And remember that mental imagery is just a form of perceptual representation. So if sensory stimulation-driven perceptual representations can be unconscious, then why couldn't mental imagery, which is perceptual representation that's not triggered directly by the sensory input, could not be unconscious? So I think that's important to acknowledge that. Or to think of mental imagery as this kind of category that's not based on this kind of first-personal introspective report. And as every kind of scientific category, it should be publicly observable. And there's a very, we know a lot about visual system at this point, and we can tell when the visual system, especially the early cortices, represent something. And so if I put you in a scanner and I ask you to visualize an apple, you tell me that, oh yeah, I just visualized an apple, but I can check. If nothing shows up in your primary visual cortex, or maybe some other parts of the visual cortex, then you're just lying. You did not visualize an apple. You said that you did, but you didn't. And conversely, you might have and I think that is true for some of the aphantasia patients or aphantasia subjects. Aphantasia is not. It's like various different neural causes can lead to aphantasia, because aphantasia is just when you're saying that you don't have conscious mental imagery. At least in some cases, what happens is that you try to visualize an apple and you say that, well, I see no images, but there is the cortices, your early visual cortices, they work exactly the same way as someone's early visual cortices who does have mental imagery. So this comes that kind of these two things kind of come apart in both ways. You can have mental imagery in the sense of early perceptual representation that's not triggered by the sensory input, and you report nothing, or the other way around.
The question I have here is, you mentioned a few times, is representation and perception, and there's been a lot of ink spilled on that. I can't recall. I didn't look closely at the the notes or the bibliography at the end of the book, but I can't remember if you cite Merleau-Ponty and some of his work on perception. Obviously, he's written many things on the phenomenology of perception. But so three concepts here. How do we distinguish between, or how is there crossover between perception, so what it is to perceive something, and what it is to have a representation, and how this works with mental imagery? Because you're discussing mental imagery with these kinds of, there's a representation in the mind, or there's a way in which we're perceiving something. So how do we disentangle some of these things to kind of be by themselves, or are they always kind of dependent on each other? How do we understand this kind of perception representation piece?
Yeah, good. So, maybe that's what we should have started, is just kind of basic concepts. I should say that, I grew up with Merleau-Ponty in some ways. As an undergrad, I read a lot of Merleau-Ponty. There's no Merleau-Ponty in the references of this book. There might have been Merleau-Ponty in the references of my first book, actually, which was about perception and action. Merleau-Ponty seems more relevant there. But of course, basically every thinker who was writing about perception or the mind, at some point we're talking about mental imagery. So it's just one of those extremely wide appeal concepts that we, or at least those of us who are not aphantasia subject, we just seem to be relying on a lot, and so there's just a lot of literature, and also in not just philosophers, but obviously psychologists, but also literary, authors, writers, novelists. They also have incredibly astute observations. I think that Marcel Proust had an extremely sophisticated theory of imagination, or imagery, actually, that probably much better than any philosophers I know. So how are these concepts related? And actually, I do want to go back, because you talked about predictive coding and priors, and that's also an important concept there. So the way I think about the mind is that its basic building blocks are representations. Representations represent something as having a certain property. Some of these representations are going to be perceptual representations. Some others are non-perceptual representations. Perception is a representational process. It's the function. What perception does is that it creates a representation out of the sensory input. And then we use this representation for various purposes. We use it to guide action. We can also use it to somehow feature in our various reasoning and inferences and justify beliefs and all that stuff. But I'm a firm believer of perceptual representations. I fully realize that there are people who are not. And I'm not. This book was not supposed to be a debate with them. I think if you're really very adamant that perception is not representational, then you can understand my claim about mental imagery in terms of perceptual processing that is not directly triggered by sensory input. So in the book, actually, I go back and forth between talking about perceptual representation and perceptual processing. So nothing really depends on that, on whether you think of the mind as representational or not. Arguably, Merleau-Ponty didn't. I don't know who's to tell. So I wanted to this book is not supposed to be one of those kind of inside baseball things that's, there's this philosophy debate about, is perception representation or not, naive realism versus representation. It's not supposed to be taking sides of these things, because I'm interested in a phenomenon, mental imagery, or rather what I mean by mental imagery, this kind of I think it's really important for understanding a number of mental phenomena. And if we kind of pull together the role that it plays in various different mental phenomena, then we can really make progress in understanding a number of different aspects of the mind. So I'm trying to be as neutral as possible about this kind of theoretical assumptions.
You talk about this phenomenon aspect of it. So in terms of the representations there, how do you see it, I guess, or how are you seeing it in this way of, is it kind of in a subject object kind of way? And so you're saying like, well, I'm the subject, here's the object, or are you also including, again, the whole phenomenological experience of it, or you're not even playing that game? You're
I see. Okay, no, I think I understand where you're coming from, the whole phenomenology stuff. So I think that representation is a much more basic concept than consciousness or than phenomenology. My own view is that phenomenology or phenomenal feel, when you're looking at a green leaf, then the green phenomenal feel is going to somehow depend on or supervene on our various perceptual representations. It's my view, and I don't rely on this in this book. Again, this is not supposed to be this kind of inside baseball stuff. But I do think that somehow representation is a more fundamental concept than consciousness. Some of our representations are conscious, some others are not conscious. But I think consciousness is an interesting question. I'm not that interested in it, frankly. I'm more interested in how various mental capacities work, whether or not they're conscious. So mental imagery is a case in point. But maybe let's talk about the different phenomena like attention. Attention is a super important phenomenon in the human mind, not just for understanding perception, but for our mental well-being. And there's more and more stuff about the relation between attention and addiction, for example. So it's very crucial. But I think when we're trying to understand attention, we should not try to understand conscious attention, and then I have a theory of that. We should understand attention, which, as we know from a lot of empirical research, can be conscious and unconscious, and how attention works and what it does, and how that changes the way our mind operates. And whether or not it's conscious, it's a secondary question. And the same with mental imagery, the same with perception. When we try to understand perception, we should not really start with consciousness. We should try to understand what the perceptual system does. And then once we understood that, then maybe we can add the stuff about consciousness. So I don't like to start with consciousness. Consciousness is a kind of a nice last explanatory step, but definitely not the first one.
Yeah. So what do you make of, we can dovetail in two ways here. What do you make about the role of the body in mental imagery? So one connection here is I mentioned earlier that it's not just visual. You have all the senses there, which I would say is an aspect of the body. Yeah. And then you also talk about in the middle of the book about the multisensory and multimodal capacities of mental imagery. So we can maybe tie those two together, but what do you think about those components and the role of the body if you have any?
Yeah, I think I begin to see what kind of direction you're coming from. So I feel that the body, I don't think anyone in the whole world, in the entire philosophical discipline, denies that the body is very important for perception or for the function of the human mind in general. So yeah, one aspect of it is the multimodality of perception and of imagery. So multimodality just means that we perceive the world via many sense modalities, so we just don't just see it, which might sound somewhat disembodied, but of course we touch it, lick it, sniff it. And this all involves the body. It involves the body in various different ways. Most of it involves our various bodily actions. So vision would not be possible if we did not move our eyes.
Right.
What makes visual processing possible is that our eyes dart around with great speed. If it didn't, there wouldn't be any visual perception. And a little less known fact, but the same is true for smell. So what in fancy terms they call olfaction, which just means smell. That would not be olfactory perception. That would not be smell if it were not for sniffing.
Mm-hmm.
So, fun fact: if you someone artificially you block someone's sniffing action, then there's going to be very little olfactory perception, very little very little smell experience. And the same is true for touch, right? I mean, when there's two different kinds of touch. One is the kind of touch when you press a quarter against the palm of my hand, but the other one is when I run my hand through my keyboard, mm-hmm. where the way my hand moves is very much constitutive of how the experience unfolds. So I think that you don't have to be kind of sectarian in order to acknowledge that there are various actions that go into perception, and also that the body is clearly very very important. But I'm gonna say just one more thing about the importance of the body, and that's not about mental imagery, but about motor imagery, which is very related. There's actually a chapter on the book about motor imagery. Mm-hmm. So mental imagery is a perceptual state. It's a perceptual state that's not quite that's not triggered by the input. It kind of starts a little later. And motor imagery is the exact opposite of that. So that's a motor state. That's something that comes in action execution, but it doesn't trigger the action. And that's very clearly something that has that very heavily relies on the representation of our own body. You couldn't really have motor representation or imagining doing something if you didn't represent, where your hands are, where the object is in relation to your hands when you're performing the action. So yeah, the body is important, but I should say that's not kind of a controversial claim. No one denies that the body is important.
So, certainly, I think some people may overemphasize it. Right. I don't think maybe some people underemphasize it. Most people say yes, that there's a importance to it. Of course, I do think some people may overemphasize or put too many eggs in that basket. But there's different ways of conceptualizing. So, what happens when there's dysfunction or disorder with the body and or with the mind? You talk about pain. Pain is super interesting in terms of pain perception and even how it works in the brain. Folks that are blind, you spend some time talking there, and synesthesia, which is really kind of been it's puzzled people for a while. What do you make when in different components, whether there's a malfunction or disorder visually or with the senses or with pain, how do we then understand a person's capacity or ability to make accurate representations, accurate whatever that may be, of what's going on in their natural world?
Good. So I think there's a lot of things can go wrong in our human, in the perceptual system and the human mind in general, because the human mind is very complex. So a lot of things have to come together in order for us to have to perceive the world in a way that guides our actions well, something like that. And each of these things that is supposed to come together can break down. So depending on that, that's going to be different issues. And I do talk about a number of these things. I talk about the blind for a number of reasons. One of them is because it's kind of a little known fact that the vast majority of blind people do have mental imagery. And I think there's a lot of really interesting and cool things that can be done to help blind people with the help of imagery. So, for example, echolocation and sensory substitution. So I talk about those a little bit. Maybe just in terms of kind of when things go wrong, I should emphasize that we already talked about it a lot, and maybe I don't want to go back to it too much, but maybe that's something that needs to be heard. Aphantasia. So there's a way in which people could construe aphantasia as as a bad thing. And I think many people, and as you can imagine, I talk to a lot of aphantasia books. Each time I give a talk, there's going to be some aphantasia subjects in the audience, and they were like, "Oh my God, I don't have mental imagery." So it should be. I think it's really important to know that aphantasia is actually a good thing. There's some new studies that show that there's much less mental health issues with people for aphantasia. And part of the reason for that, and that's, I guess, is the main way in which I want to answer your question, is that it seems that a lot of mental health issues are very intimately and intricately connected to mental imagery. And not just the kind of obvious ones. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is clearly just mental imagery going wrong. Yeah. But even depression is very much reliant on what kind of mental imagery that you have, not just about the future, but about the past and about the present. And basically in all kinds of mental health issues, some of the most recent and most kind of hyped or most efficient ways of treating them have to do with mental imagery. So there's kind of a big boom of using mental imagery in mental health practices. Mm-hmm. EMDR is one of them. Talk about that a little bit in the book. So the eye movement stuff that is very very hyped these days. Mm-hmm. And so if you have aphantasia, your mental imagery is going to be much weaker, and you have much less of an issue with these things. Mm. Whereas hyperaphantasia people, they're really very high risk. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's difficult to know what's kind of so what is it, a disorder? I mean, what kind of disorder is it? If you have aphantasia, yeah, you don't have the ability to have mental imagery, but then on the other hand, you're going to have much less issues with mental health. So I don't think that you can kind of frame any of this as mm-hmm. disorder or as some kind of abnormality.
Let's talk about. I'm glad you brought up the disorders thing. So maybe we'll fight about this. I don't know how you feel about it, but
good. Yeah, this should be more disagreement.
I guess I have one thing I want to ask about, but let me talk about the PTSD and the EMDR and stuff. Huh? So I'm gonna have the somewhat unpopular opinion. So a lot of people like EMDR. They like EMDR for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert in this. I don't read this literature that closely, but the literature I have read, as recent as a couple years ago, was EMDR is for listeners. It's rapid eye. What has to stand for? Eye desensitization movement, whatever it is. I forget the
eye movement desensitization.
Yeah, and usually it's sometimes people have like a bar, and they'll have like lights that go backwards and forwards horizontally. Sometimes it will be another type of light. Sometimes it will be with your hand. There's different kinds of ways in which people do it, and I'm sure there's something behind it. But much of the research shows that the efficacy of EMDR, which started in the late 80s, early 90s, but the literature we have now of 30 years now is it's really exposure to the events that the person has in the mind. So you kind of do this covert desensitization, right? So I want someone has a let's just take fear of bridges or something, and they say, okay, well, you have to kind of get them there, but you start by doing a lot of mental imagery work. Or sometimes if you want to, in the opposite way, you want to have them, if they get flooded or overwhelmed, to have a relaxation kind of imagery, right? So this is used therapeutically and there's a lot of really good utility there. But I think in terms of EMDR though, I think the jury's still out on the rapid eye movement and the light and the movement of the hand. People don't really subscribe, critics of it don't subscribe any efficacy to that. It's mostly the imagery work that people use with exposure therapy. And of course, people that are really into EMDR, they'll swear by it. The eye movements is an absolutely essential feature. And thus far, it seems that that's not the case, or at the very least, there's mixed evidence on that. I don't know if you want to get that into the weeds of it, but I guess the underlying point is that the exposure piece is important, but EMDR itself is the components of the rapid eye movement is less important from what what I have read. What are your thoughts here on this?
So I don't get me wrong. So I'm not like a big. I don't have a business model riding on the on the success of EMDR. So I don't
You don't have any stocks in EMDR.
I don't have any stocks in EMDR. And I feel that it's incredibly overhyped at this point, and I think there's a lot of people going in there. They expect that no matter what they do, they're just their problems are gonna be solved with the EMDR, and that's just clearly not the case. I think I can explain with the help of various ongoing research on mental imagery why it works when it works, but I can also maybe explain why it doesn't work when it does not work. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to see that it's not going to work for everyone. Mm-hmm. Nothing works for everyone, and to know what it depends on whether it works or not. So maybe should I talk about why it works, and is it interesting?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the way I understand EMDR working is based on three big claims about mental imagery. Each of them are we have independent, extremely solid evidence for. Mm. One of them is not really about imagery; it's about memory. So the way memory works is not that when you have a memory, then you somehow you take it when you remember something, you take it out of your kind of memory storage, you contemplate it, and then you stuff it back unchanged. And the next time you remember again, you take it out, put it back. Each time this is what's been the big finding in memory research in the last 20 years. The act of remembering changes the memory. So when you remember something,
sorry, I just want to clarify. I don't want to interrupt. Is it the retrieval? You're talking about the retrieval process, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
So that's why I describe it as the act of remembering. So the retrieval of a memory mm-hmm. changes the memory itself. So when you kind of put it back, it's a different memory. So next time you remember it is going to be a different memory than previously. Mm-hmm. So there we have incredibly strong evidence for that. That's one thing. The other thing is that it's more in mental imagery land, is that episodic memory, when you remember something episodically, so when you remember seeing something, you remember hearing something, you remember touching something, mm-hmm. That is a form of mental imagery.
Okay. So the episodic there's different components of memory, obviously, but there's something critical about the episodic memory of it.
Yeah, so I mean, memory researchers make this distinction between semantic and episodic memory. So semantic memory is when you remember that you had, scrambled egg for breakfast. And episodic memory is when you remember eating the scrambled egg. You remember the taste, you remember the color, you remember the sizzling of the egg. So that's the big difference. And episodic memory is a form of mental imagery. You don't have an episodic memory. It's basically a form of mental imagery that has some kind of link to the past. And that's the second finding. So when you're actually recalling something, when you're remembering something, that is a way of constructing mental imagery. And the third big finding is about eye movement. So we talked a little bit about eye movements, about how visual perception relies on the eye movements. And if I block your eyes, it's a very cruel procedure, but artificially block your eyes, then you're not going to see anything. Similarly, if you're visualizing something and I block your eyes, it's going to be either very, very, very vague or no imagery whatsoever. And when you are, and if I'm asking you to visualize visualize the Eiffel Tower, then you're going to have your eye movements are going to be such that they're going to be very similar to the eye movements you would have if you were looking at the Eiffel Tower. So visual imagery is as reliant on eye movements as visual perception. And if I block your eye movement, then the vividness is going to suffer. So what EMDR does is that it doesn't block your eye movements, because that's just a really painful and shitty procedure, but it forces you to have a certain kind of eye movement that's not the same as the eye movement that you would have if you were actually visualizing the recently recalled episodic memory, which is usually a traumatic event. So what's happening is that you take out your old memory you're trying to form a mental image of it, but because of the eye movements, you can't.
Mm-hmm.
Or your mental imagery that's brought up is going to be much less vivid because your eye movement is busy doing this rather than enacting the actual mental image. And then when you're stuffing it back, then it's going to be a much less vivid imagery that you're stuffing back. Now, this is the way it's supposed to work. This is the way it works when it works. It's not going to work when you're bad, for example, at recalling the event. Mm-hmm. At least voluntarily recalling the event. Mm-hmm. And that is one big, huge problem for all kinds of imagery related psychiatric practices. Because very often they use the therapeutic imagery. They ask you to visualize being on a beach or something, visualize the 10 best things that happened to you or the 10 worst things that happened to you. It's very difficult to know what that really means to do that. If I have just like one flashback, is that does that count? Or what if I just say that I did? So it's very difficult to control. It's very difficult to maintain mental imagery. So there's definitely more like a room for improvement. But that's my take on EMDR, and I think that one of the reasons, one of the nice things about doing research on these things, it's not just kind of a theoretical importance of let's try to understand what mental imagery is. Of course, it has real life applications.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's the real. Yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of applicability there. I would say that also with retrieval of memories, we're terrible at doing that, and we get things mixed up. And there's a lot of state-dependent memory. There's all of these things, and so just relying on the memory and then relying on the accuracy of the person. Are they malingering? Are they over-reporting or under-reporting something? Are they accurate remembering? That's why we don't. The false memory kind of phenomenon is a huge thing. That's why we don't rely on people taking people out of a lineup when they're trying to catch a criminal because people remember. There's all these issues with it, and then your explanation was really good, but again, the eye movement piece of it is fine, but I think most people will agree that the exposure component of it is probably what is doing it. Because I think you could probably do, like, for example, if you do exposure therapy where you don't have any of the eye movements, you can still have curative effects. EMDR is not, so the eye movement is not essential, but it's crazy. I mean, you were saying about how people believe in it. I mean, I've been to trainings at big conferences where people that are big EMDR trained people will say, in 1 or 2 sessions, we pretty much cure this person of their trauma. And it's like, and this can work for everybody. I mean, right there is where this is absolute fucking bullshit.
I can totally see that it can, in a couple of sessions, you could do that if subject is such that. So here's one thing that all of this kind of presupposes, that the subject is going to be good at just retrieving the trauma in its full shittiness and put it in the mind's eye.
Right.
If you're good, if that does happen, which actually does happen in kind of early stages of trauma sometimes, but that's not the part. It depends on a lot of things about what your mental setup, what you do with trauma, whether you really try to hide it from yourself or not. Mm-hmm. All of these things are going to be extremely variable, and any of the stuff that I talked about is only going to work if you actually manage to access this traumatic event and create a mental imagery of it, create this episodic memory of it. And many people are just not very good at that. Or for better or for worse, right? I mean,
Yeah, or it's confabulated somehow, or there's a lot of confusion. Yeah, it's not there's a lot of things in the mix there.
And there's it relies on voluntary recall, and another Proustian theme is that involuntary memories are often much stronger and much more. Much larger part of the mind is accessible to involuntary memory than voluntarily. Counting to 3 and recall your traumatic event. So there's clearly a lot of room for improvement.
So I guess I'm going to come to like kind of this metaphysical question, or even you could say an ontological question, which is, and maybe you're not trying to do that, but is everything okay? 2 questions. One, is everything then just representations without sensory input, right? In terms of our reality of the world. and 2, doesn't matter? Because the question you could go with that is, how do we know, for example, someone that has various types of hallucinations, right? And they're not quote unquote real, but they are real to the person. They're really hearing the stimuli, they're really seeing it, or they're really feeling the stimuli, but other people in shared reality do not. And or the impact and role of um, uh, hallucinogens. People take psilocybin, people take marijuana, they take LSD, they take maybe some aspects of MDMA, and they're having things that are representations, but they're not of this shared reality. So how much of the like what is and what is not real is actually an important question with no altered states, whether that's an organic aspect, which in terms of psychosis, if you will, or if it's a imposed one through a substance. Does that even matter? Does the question matter, or how do you see this then?
Well, I mean, I think it does matter. No, I mean, this matters for our everyday life. No, doesn't it?
I guess it matters for cohabitating shared reality with other humans, but I mean, people have ideas about it. They have different ideas about, because, for example, right? If I really were to explain to someone, the green leaf that you're seeing, you're not actually seeing the color green because green doesn't actually really exist, right? Telling people that is a mind fuck. But you could say it is empirically true, but does it matter? Because the reality we're seeing, when I look at outside and I see all of the changing of the leaves, or I see the color of the flowers, but it's real in one sense, but it's not entirely real. They're representations in one aspect. And then if you look at other types of insects or animals, they have different types of vision where they have ways of seeing things that humans cannot see, such as UV rays, things like that, or ultraviolet, or the night vision, things like that. Things are different, and so reality looks different based on your perception and or your representation. So what can we say? Should we ask that question? Is it really real, or does that not matter?
I do believe in reality. Maybe it's a controversial claim, but I do believe in reality. But I also think that's what's like. I mean, we're kind of moving away from mental imagery, but these are kind of fun questions. So I think that we're gonna access very different parts, very different aspects of reality, depending on our mental capacities, depending on our perceptual system. So different creatures, different animals, they have they will be sensitive to very different aspects of the reality. But I think it's a good idea to somehow think of some kind of external world that we have some kind of access to, because I don't know. Because otherwise, it's going to be difficult to explain how come that we can, build bridges that are going to hold up, and we can put together computers that allow us to have a Zoom interview.
Right, but you people.
So you can kind of starting with this kind of solipsistic view is that it's only kind of me and my reality, and that might have little to do with other people's reality. Right. It's going to be there's a lot of things that are going to be difficult to explain, and so I think that we can have the general kind of intuition behind that, while also acknowledging that there is some kind of mind-independent reality, as long as we acknowledge the differences that you and I, and especially my cat and I, we're gonna just be sensitive to a very different aspect of the reality. And I actually did talk a little bit about one way in which, even within the same species, you and I might have very different experience of looking at the same thing. So there's this poster behind you, really cool repeating patterns and stuff. You look at it, and when I look at it, I think it's a very different experience that we have, because your perceptual history with this image is very different from my perceptual history with this image.
So what do you see when you see it? I can explain it to our listeners, but what do you see though?
I see little foxes, maybe, and it's an interesting Galapagos. I guess not foxes, some kind of animals. And it's a bistable image, so that you can look at them as black. You look at the black animals, and then the white is going to be background. You can look at the white animals, and the black is going to be background. But I have my own perceptual history of looking at, I don't know, Escher drawings and stuff like that, that are similar. You have a very different perceptual history because you looked at different pictures in your life. And one thing that we know about the perceptual system is that history matters. What I see now, when you look at something, is heavily dependent on the things that I have seen in my previous many years. So that's one aspect in which, there's the same object out there, and I don't want to deny that there is an actual object out there, but your experience is going to be radically different from my experience. And I think that one nice thing about trying to unify the empirical sciences and philosophy when it comes to perception is to try to understand why that is and how that is. So you can explain this kind of touchy-feely things about how, when you're looking at it, you see something different from when I'm looking at it, in terms of, hard facts about the perceptual system.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. I think the questions there are that people have these ideas that, maybe there is no reality. And I agree with you. I think there is a reality. But I do agree that I think it's complicated. And I definitely think people have different experiences of it, even within the same reality, which I don't think is a contradiction. But I think it's just part of being a complicated organism that's moving around the world, and they're experiencing different things. Let
me just say one more thing. It's not even two different people. So when you first bought this poster, your experience was very different than it is now, right?
Certainly.
And that's the same person, right? The same object, same person. But given that you had a different time slice of the same person, you had different perceptual history then than you do now with this picture, with this image. Your experience will have been very different.
Yeah, I mean, I could riff on that for a while, but I guess my summary of what I want to say on that is, I mean, the phenomenologists really got a good grip in me when I read them so many years ago. But for something like this, to me, I agree. I totally agree with you. I think how do I say this? The phenomenological experience of being in a space or being in a type of space over time through history has a different experiential element to it than at any other point. So, like, if you were to take the idea of a house, a house is just a house, right? It's, whatever the materials, and you live in there, but there's nothing in one sense, there's nothing alive in the house. In one sense, it's just, walls and a ceiling and a floor and doors and handles, and yes, you can put stuff in the house. But I think when you have a person, that, or people that are in a house, there's parts of you that are in the space. It's a living space. And so, for example, if you take about it in the opposite, if somebody comes into your home and they rummage through everything, and maybe they do or they don't take anything, you feel violated. But nothing's happened to the house. The house is still the same. Maybe all your stuff's still the same. But it doesn't matter, because we attach aspects of our phenomenological experience of residing in a space that we consider our own, but we have different ideas or rules about that. And I do think that there is a disruption of the space because of how we create it. And that has significance within ourselves of the first day you move into a house, as opposed to living there after 30 years. There's memories, there's experiences. That's maybe not tangible, but the phenomenology is still in the space. And so I think it's sort of similar to what you're saying is
absolutely. But I'm, and I can see that, the phenomenologists, they talk about similar things, but we also just have like really hard science reasons to believe that on the basis of what we know about, top-down influences on perception. The way the perception works, it depends on what kind of other mass you have in your head. And you have different kind of mass in your head now than when you got that picture. And the perceptual learning stuff. the mere exposure effect, one of my favorites, that this phenomenon that often you're exposed to a certain kind of stimulus, the more you're going to like it.
Mm-hmm.
It's very well replicated studies.
Mm.
All of that stuff is going to push you in this direction. But in general, I mean, I feel that one thing that philosophy is really good at, and one thing that's the reason why I'm doing philosophy really, is that you can explain stuff that we really care about. Mm-hmm. And I keep on using the term touchy-feely because that's what they are, like touchy-feely things that feel like really close to our heart. And it's as lofty as it gets in terms of like very simple and hard, well studied empirical phenomena. I think that's a beautiful thing when you can explain something really complex in terms of something really simple.
So let me ask you two final questions here. Okay. You have this chapter on art at the end of the book, which I thought was really interesting, right? Could you expound upon that, about how you see mental imagery as being kind of used within the aesthetics or in art, and how we understand that? I mean, when I think of art, I mean, art is such a broad term, but we can say fine art, or we could say in music or in literature or whatever. But how do you see the importance of mental imagery in art, various forms of art?
So when I don't do philosophy of mind and I write about aesthetics, I kind of try to divide my time evenly between the mind and the arts or aesthetics, partly because I think that aesthetics is really also about just try to understand how our mind works when we're listening to music or when we're watching a film. Mm-hmm. How come the difference between a good film and a bad film? I mean, in some very obvious ways, is about how our mind works when you're watching it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that I'm gonna do that big, like a longish chapter. I think it's actually the longest chapter. It's supposed to be just an appendix, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's the longest chapter on the role of mental imagery in various art forms. And maybe it's just so many sources of mental imagery, especially in the visual arts. But maybe I just highlight one, and that's expectation. Mm. And expectation is it's a huge thing in our lives in general. Expectation is extremely important in understanding perception, because much of perception is really going to be heavily dependent on expectation. So one famous example: if I'm expecting, I'm at a pain experiment, and experimenters said that they're gonna poke me with a needle at the back of my head, and I'm expecting that, but in fact it's an ice cube that touches the back of my neck. I am going to actually experience a stabbing pain of a needle. Expectation is so important very often, and expectation is also incredibly important in various arts, and especially in music, where there's been how us expecting how a certain tune is going to continue is just incredibly important. So that maybe I would highlight that an expectation, or at least many forms of expectation. The forms of expectation that is important in art is going to count as a form of what I call temporal mental imagery, when you have mental imagery of the next moment.
The last question is, what do you want people to really understand about mental imagery from your book, or even just from the conversation? But what is the thing that you really want folks to really kind of grab onto?
Well, maybe that this seemingly very simple phenomenon that we're all familiar with can really go a very long way in helping us understand even the most complicated mental phenomena, right? Like decision making, or desires, or cognitive dissonance, or implicit bias. All of these things have a chapter in the book, a separate chapter in the book. And so you can rely on things that you're kind of familiar with from your life to understand these very complex and complicated phenomena.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Mental Imagery: Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience. Where's the best places to get in touch with you, or to engage with you, if there are any?
I'm on the social media. Sometimes, less so now than I used to be with recent changes. and yeah, you could also find my email address if you really want to.
Okay, that's good. This was so much fun. I really enjoyed the conversation and thinking about all these different things.
Really fun questions. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Ciao. Bye. Thanks.